From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
We're about to hear from Daniel Pink. He tells us what we really ought to know about ourselves. In his recent book, Drive, he told us, and business, that carrots and sticks are not necessarily the best way to motivate us. Now the Washington writer and the book's bestseller is out with To Sell is Human, the surprising truth about moving others. Pink says the capacity to sell is not unnatural or a gift. It's in all of us, and that we all may not like it or recognize it, but it's true. And one reviewer said he makes the art of selling seem less grimy. Daniel Pink is a Yale-trained lawyer. I love the rain. I'm sorry. I wish I were watching it. Yep. Pink is a Yale-trained lawyer, and he's a former speechwriter for Al Gore. So he knows something about trying to sell us something. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Daniel Pink.
All right, thank you, Tom, for that nice introduction. Can you hear me back there in the cheap seats? Yeah, good, all right. So, well, thanks, Tom, for the nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Anybody here from out of town? All right, great. Well, I want to welcome you to dark and gloomy and menacing Washington, D.C. And then there's the weather. Thank you. All right, so I am so excited to tell you about this new book right here, To Sell is Human. It's the latest book. I'm excited to tell you about it, take your questions about it. But I want to tell you a little bit of the backstory behind it. Every once in a while, people say to me, Dan, which is your favorite book? I've written 5 books, and they say to me, Dan, which is your favorite book? Right? That's an unbelievably rude question to ask, right? I mean, at some level, books are like children, right? You love them all equally. You might love them differently in different ways, but you love them all equally. So when someone says, which is your favorite book, it's sort of like asking somebody, who's your favorite child, okay? It's a very offensive question. I don't like it. But this is my favorite book. And I want to tell you the reason why. I think I learned more for myself in writing this book than I did in the previous books. It's been really useful to me. It was a great journey, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. So what I want to do here, the way I look at all of you here is that this setting here, the National Book Festival, isn't so much like a car showroom, but a little bit more like a car show, all right? So like at car shows, you have the gearheads, all right? These are not people who just want to look at a car. These are people who want to look under the hood. These are people who want to know how the engine works, all right? And so we're at a car show like that. All of you are kind of literary gearheads. So I want to tell you kind of how I came to write this. And then what I want to do is, in some ways, open up the hood a little bit, tell you how I put this book together, and then we'll take some questions, all right? So let's get started. So here's how I came to this book. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Drive. And thank you. All right. I didn't realize I had family in the audience. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Drive, and that book is about the science of motivation. And what I did is I went back and looked at about 50 years of research in human motivation to try to understand, what are we doing right and wrong in organizations and in schools. And the big takeaway from that book, the big takeaway from these 50 years of social science is this. There's one key conceptual idea in that book, and that it is this. There's a certain kind of reward that we use in organizations. I call it an if-then reward, all right? A controlling contingent reward. Think of it as an if-then reward. If you do this, then you get that. If you do this, then you get that, all right? Controlling contingent reward. And here's what 50 years of social science tells us about that kind of reward. Not about all rewards, but about that kind of reward. 50 years of social science tells us very clearly the following. If-then rewards are great for simple, mechanical, and short-term tasks. They work really well for simple, algorithmic kinds of tasks with short time horizons. The research doesn't say we don't care about rewards. We love rewards, all right? They get our attention, but they get our attention in a particular way, a very focused, narrow way. That frame of mind is great if you know precisely what you need to do. You need to follow a recipe, get to the conclusion. So if-then rewards are great for simple, algorithmic, mechanical tasks. However, the same body of research tells us that they are less great for more complicated, complex, conceptual kinds of tasks that have longer time horizons. So again, if-then rewards, great for simple and short term, not so great for complex and long term. That's what that book is about. You actually don't even need to read it now. You should buy it. But no. So one of the things that I've done, and here we're opening the hood a little bit, is that I think it's really important today in this world that's very transparent, where you have social media, where there's a greater connection among people, to be very open to hearing from readers. And so one of the things that I've done is I've always put my contact information on my book jackets. As a consequence of that, the great part about that is that I get a lot of email from readers. All right? The negative part about that is that, no. And so very quickly, literally in the first week that book was out, I started getting questions from readers. And the questions from readers went like this. This is interesting. What about sales? This is really interesting. What about sales? How do we motivate salespeople? What's a typical way we motivate salespeople? Commissions, right, commissions. If you sell, then you feed your family. If you don't sell, then you hit the bricks, all right? So that's how we motivate. So are salespeople an exception? Pretty interesting question. So I started thinking about that. Then I started hearing from some companies who said, you know what, this book is actually pretty interesting because it explains something peculiar that we did at our company that worked, but I couldn't understand why that it worked. And they said, well, what happened is that we eliminated commissions for salespeople and saw sales go up. Whoa, that's kind of freaky. So I realized that this world of sales was actually pretty interesting. When I started entering it, though, when I started trying to just get smarter on it so I could answer reader questions without sounding like a fool, I went to look at the typical books on sales, and they were terrible. I mean, I wanted just to like Purell my hands afterwards. They were so horrible, right? So then I said, okay, well, let me take a different look at this. Let's see what's happening in North American business schools, all right? How are business, you're laughing, good, thank you. Business schools don't teach sales. It's unbelievable to me. Certainly elite business schools don't teach sales. Elite business schools will teach sometimes something called sales management. Sales management, where you can learn to manage the great unwashed who are actually keeping your company in business. And so I said, let's try to do this. This is a really interesting topic. It's underexplored. It's a really central part of, here's our pavilion, contemporary life. Let's try to write a book about sales for people who might never read a book about sales. Probably like many of you. Let's write a book about sales that a teacher might want to read. Let's write a book about sales that a middle manager might want to read. Let's write a book about sales that a nurse or a doctor might want to read. So let's write a book about sales for the rest of us. So that's what I set out to do, and I want to tell you about it. And again, I'm going to open up the hood. I'm going to tell you how this book is organized, right? I'm going to tell you there's a theory here of how I organize this book, and I want to tell you, I want to expose it to you right here. So what I said is this. Here's my view of things, all right? Again, we're at a car show now, so I can talk about like a V6 engine versus a V8 engine. Ordinarily would empty the room, but here I think you might appreciate it. So there are different kinds of books in nonfiction. There are different kinds of books in nonfiction. A variety of kinds of books. One genre of books is what you can think of as the big idea book, right? You read this book, it recasts how you see the world. The big idea book. I love those kinds of books. Another kind of nonfiction book is a book that is a little bit more directive. It tells you, here are some things that you can do. Here are some ways to transform your life. And my view is that I'm frustrated by both of those books. I love them both. I read a big idea book, and I get to the end of it and say, oh my God, you've recast how I think about the world. What should I do about it? And the book is over. You didn't bother to tell me what to do. Other times you have books that are very directive, do these 3 things, do those 4 things, and the whole time you're saying, well, how do you know? So what I tried to do is what I tried to do in all of my books is marry those 2 genres, all right? I have again, some changes in contemporary life. I have a very, like many of us now, have a much more expansive definition of marriage, right? So I'm trying to marry these two genres, the big idea book and the book that has practical, tactical takeaways. So that's what I tried to do. Now, in structuring a book like that, you have to actually be very careful. You have to architect it very carefully. So here's what I did. I took the first third of this book, that I ingeniously called Part 1, all right? The first third of this book. And I said, I'm going to lay out some ideas here, some changes that I'm seeing, some changes that are verified by a lot of the research that's going on. And so there are two catalytic ideas here in this book. Number one, like it or not, we're all in sales now. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. If you look very closely at what people do on the job, you're selling. Some of us, a lot of us, are selling products and services, right? You're selling a Winnebago. You're selling consulting services. You're selling pies at a farmer's market. We have a huge number of people in this country whose job it is to sell things directly. But the rest of us, according to some pretty interesting survey research and data analytics that we did, the rest of us are spending an enormous amount of time on our jobs selling in a broader sense. We're persuading, influencing, convincing people. We're persuading people to give up something in exchange for something else. This is what I like to call non-sales selling. Non-sales selling. It's a huge part of what we do on the job today. So, what does that mean? It means you're a boss and you're trying to get people to do something different or do something in a different way. It means that you're an individual inside of an organization and you're trying to get someone to work on your team rather than another team. You're selling. It means that you're recruiting somebody, come and work at our organization rather than another organization. You're selling. You're trying to convince, persuade students, pay attention in class, do your homework. You're selling. And this is a different kind of selling. It's selling with a twist. You're selling, but the cash register is not ringing. You're selling, but money's not changing hands. You're selling, but the denomination isn't dollars or pesos or euros. It is time, effort, attention, energy, zeal, commitment, whatever, all these intangible things. So, and this is a big part about how we're spending our time at work. In my view, the vocabulary we use to describe our work, to describe our economy writ large, is way too narrow, way too constricted. We talk about producing, we talk about consuming, but a big part of what all of us here do on the job is try to move other people. Okay, so one idea in this first third of the book where I'm laying out the big idea is, like it or not, we're all in sales now. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. That's one of the two big ideas. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. You see that I'm a firm believer in the rhetorical power of repetition. No, I'm not kidding. I'm a firm believer in the rhetorical. So that's one idea. So if you think about, I want you to think about your own work. This is what I'm trying to do here. This is what I sit in my office sweating about. I want people to think differently, more accurately about your work. No matter what you do, I want you to think, what do you actually do? And I think if you break a sweat and think about it, you're going to realize you're spending a decent amount of time trying to move people, persuade people, convince people. Okay, now, the first idea is, like it or not, we're all in sales, which leads to the second idea, which is this. When I make this claim, if I were to go out into this, the mall there, and stop someone and say, hey, you just won the lottery, they'd be pretty pumped. If I were to go out there and stop someone and say, hey, even though you're not in sales, you're really in sales, they'd typically be less pumped, right? So why is that? There's a very negative association with sales. We think of it as sleazy and slimy and duplicitous and manipulative and pushy and annoying and smarmy and deceitful and underhanded. Right? That's really what most of us think about that. And I'm convinced that view is totally outdated. Here's what I mean by that. How many of you sort of relish the idea of being in sales? Exactly. Okay, we got a few salespeople here. But most of us find it kind of icky, right? But I think that's a misguided view. So let me just lay this out here, then we'll turn the corner. Here's what I think that view of sales as slimy and sleazy and duplicitous and icky is a view not about sales per se, but a view about the conditions in which sales have long taken place. Here's what I mean by that. Most of what we know about sales comes from a world of information asymmetry. All right? Information, I'm going to go heavy on you in the afternoon. I'm going to talk about information asymmetry, all right? Information asymmetry. Whoop! Where the seller always has more information than the buyer. When the seller has more information than the buyer, the seller can rip you off. It's that simple. Most of our negative associations with sales come from being buyers in a world of information asymmetry. Most of our experience, most of what we've learned about sales comes from this kind of world, a world where buyers have not many choices, no way to talk back, and are at a huge information disadvantage. That's the world of buyer beware. You better beware, because the slimy, sleazy, smarmy salespeople with a massive information advantage are going to rip you off. But do we live in a world of information asymmetry today? Less and less and less and less and less and less. Case in point. Let me see if you can get, okay, so here we are. This is a great American contemporary life question. It's a great American contemporary life question. We asked people in a really interesting survey we did of 7,000 adult full-time workers. We asked people this question. Think about, I want you to give me this answer. We said to them, when you think of sales or selling, what's the first picture that comes to mind? So somebody shout out, what's the first picture that comes to mind? Exactly. This is what we got in overwhelming numbers. We did a sample of 7,000 people, and in overwhelming numbers, we got a version of a man in a suit selling a car. Usually, the car was pretty crappy, and the suit was even crappier, all right? But think about buying a car. 20 years ago, if you went to buy a car, you went to buy a Chevy Malibu. The Chevy Malibu dealer would know more about cars, more about Chevys, more about Malibus than you ever could. Buyer beware. Anybody bought a car recently? You can go into that car dealer and you can know as much about cars, as much about Chevys, as much about Malibus as that car dealer. You can go in there and say, hi, I know what every dealer in the Washington metropolitan area is charging for this car. I've already checked. I know exactly what my trade-in is worth. You can't give me a penny less than that. I interviewed a car dealer here in Washington, D.C., who said that when she first started selling cars in the mid-1980s here in the D.C. area, the factory invoice price of the car, literally the physical document, the invoice, was locked in the safe. Even the car dealers, car salespeople weren't allowed to see it. Now, your Aunt Gladys in Sheboygan can walk into a car dealer with the factory invoice price of a car. This is a big deal. We've gone, not everywhere, but heavily, to a world where buyers have not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back, to a world where they got lots of information, lots of choices, and all kinds of ways to talk back. That's a very different world. That is a world of seller beware. Now the sellers are on notice. You can rip somebody off, but it's not going to work for very long because someone's going to tweet it, someone's going to put it on Facebook, someone's going to email it to all of their friends. So we live in a world of seller beware, not only of buyer beware. So the first third of the book is basically trying to lay out the evidence that what's going on in the world today. And what's going on in the world is this. A, like it or not, we're all in sales now, but B, sales isn't what it used to be. A world of seller beware is different in kind, not different in degree from a world of buyer beware. Big ideas! Woo! All right? But I didn't want to end the book there. I think that's wrong, all right? Because if you believe, let's just stipulate that this is more right than wrong, all right? Tom mentioned that I went to law school, so I use words like stipulate. Let's just stipulate that it's more right than wrong. I think the really intriguing question is, okay, Pink, if you're more right than wrong, what do I do? And that's the interesting question. That's the question where a book can actually change somebody's life, and that's what the second two-thirds of the book is about. So the second section of the book, which I came up with this on my own, part 2. Is devoted to looking at the social science of how people are persuaded, how people are convinced, how people are moved. As I mentioned, there aren't many scholars studying sales per se, but there are legions of scholars studying economics, behavioral economics, cognitive science, linguistics, all varieties of social psychology. And if you go wide enough and deep enough into that research, you can begin to piece together the answers to that question. Okay, what do I do about it? So, in the second section of the book, okay, we're opening the hood here, I said, I identified 3 particular qualities that are necessary. They're sort of the platform on which people are effective in moving other people, whether they're teachers, whether they're car salespeople, whether they're selling complicated computer systems to the federal government, whether you're a politician running for city council. What are the qualities that are necessary in a world where buyers and sellers are more evenly matched? And I was able to, there's an old adage in sales, ABC. A always be, B, C closing, always be closing. Always be closing, that predatory, aggressive kind of style of sales is actually not bad advice in a world where buyers have not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back. Leaving aside the morality of it, it's actually pretty effective. But it's a terrible strategy when buyers have lots of information, lots of choices, and all kinds of ways to talk back. But the social science yields a new set of ABCs. The new ABCs of moving other people. Attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. Attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. That's what the second 2/3 of the book, the second part of the book is about. Attunement. Attunement is perspective taking. Can you get out of your own head and see things from someone else's point of view? This is a very powerful human ability, but it's one that has a science to it and a place where we can use the science to get better at it. And it's an urgent task when you have less coercive power. You have to be able to see things from someone else's point of view. So what do you do to some really, really amazingly interesting research on attunement. How do you get better at seeing things from someone else's perspective? 2, buoyancy. One of the highlights, for me at least, of this book was I got a chance, I went out and tried to find a Fuller Brush man. Now, how many of you have heard of Fuller Brush? Okay, so we've just identified everybody over 40 in the audience today, all right? There was a time, Fuller Brush is a great American story. I'll spare it to you, most of it now, but there was a time in America when legions of these men, they were almost always men, would go to middle-class neighborhoods and sell brushes, right? They would have these giant cases full of cleaning brushes and scrub brushes and hair brushes and cleaning supplies, and they would knock on the door, and they would offer you something called a handy brush, this free vegetable scrubber, in order to get, here we go, it's sort of a dead metaphor now, but here's where it came from, to get a foot in the door, all right? A foot in the door. The autobiography of the guy who started the Fuller Brush Company is called A Foot in the Door, all right? These guys were ubiquitous in America for a long time, but they mostly disappeared. But I found one of the last Fuller Brushmen in America. He's a guy named Norman Hall. He's been selling brushes door to door in the business district of San Francisco for 40 years. Can you imagine selling brushes door to door for 40 years? And he said something that really stuck with me. Something that really stuck with me. It was very poetic, too. He said, you know, Dan, the hardest part about being in sales, is that every day I face, and this is his lovely phrase, every day I face an ocean of rejection. An ocean of rejection. All right? Not a pond of rejection, a river of rejection, an ocean of rejection. We hate being rejected. It's terrible when you sell stuff, when you try to sell yourself, your idea, ask somebody out on a date, try to convince somebody to do something, you're going to get rejected a lot, and we hate that. So buoyancy is, what does the social science tell us about how to stay afloat on that ocean of rejection? Some amazingly interesting stuff. What do you do before an encounter to stay buoyant? It turns out there's some great research out of the University of Illinois that says that you're better off questioning your abilities than you are pumping yourself up. What do you do during an encounter? It turns out that for negotiations and so forth, there are returns to having a positive affect, that you actually don't want to go in completely neutral, that being more positive can be extraordinarily effective. What do you do after an encounter? Some great research showing that one of the best predictors of sales success is how people explain failure. There's a certain explanatory style that they use, that there's a lovely phrase that the social psychologists use that allows them to, quote, decatastrophize failure. That is, put it in context that leaves them more buoyant for the next one. Great, great topic. And then finally, there's clarity. Clarity has two dimensions. One, we live in a world awash in information, so having access to information doesn't give you a comparative advantage. What gives you a comparative advantage is being able to make sense of that information, clarify that information, synthesize that information, separate out the signal from the noise in that information, curate that information. Second aspect of clarity is this. We tend to think that, it's all about problem solving. Problem solving. But here's the thing. If you have a client or customer and they know precisely what their problem is, they can find the solution without you. They don't need you very much. Where do they need you more? When they're wrong about their problem, or they don't know what their problem is. So the premium has shifted from the skill of problem solving to the skill of problem finding. Can you identify problems people don't realize that they have? Can you surface latent problems? Can you look down the road and say, here's something you're going to confront? So that's what part 2 is about. Here are these foundational qualities: attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. I try to give you a really rich sense of the science behind it because it's amazingly interesting. But then I have these things that as an homage to the Fuller Brush Man in the sections here, okay, we're opening the hood, whoop. I also have sections called sample cases that give you 8 or 9 or 10 tools, tips, exercises, assessments to get better at attunement. Tools, tips, exercises, and assessments to get better at buoyancy, to get better at clarity. All right, that leads us to the final section. Guess what I called it? Yes, part 3. And in there, I look at some of the more particular tactical skills that are necessary. How do you pitch more effectively? It turns out that the elevator pitch is a little passé. There are all kinds of amazingly new ways to pitch that the social science gives us some clues about how to do better. Pitching with rhymes is shockingly effective. Pitching with questions is extremely effective. Other kinds of things. Improvisation. There's a tendency that we think we have to memorize things and recite a script, but actually having improvisational skills is enormously important. Indeed, the core rules of improvisational theater are extremely important in any kind of persuasive or influence effort. How do you say yes and? How do you make your partner look good? How do you hear offers? And finally is serve. Ultimately, I think that when we try to persuade people, when we try to convince people, no matter what it is, our goal has to be to make their lives better off. Not to hoodwink them, not to convince them for the sake of convincing them, but to lead them to a higher path. And so I think there's a move now where the best sellers actually serve first and sell next, that they think of it as an act of genuine service. So that's what that section is about, and again, all kinds of tools and tips and takeaways to do that. So what I'm trying to do here is this. Give readers a new way to look at their world, and I think it's pretty compelling, but then in a very, very rich, scientific, evidence-based way say, okay, if you're looking at the world differently, here are some things you can do about it. Here are some things you can do to get a little bit better. So that's what it's about. I want to do, how are we in time? What is it now, Tuesday? Yeah. All right, we got plenty of time here. All right, so here's what I want to do here. I want to, what do I want to do? Let's do this, all right? Let's just do one exercise. There is a kind of being under a tent, a kind of revival quality to this, isn't there? Let's try to do an exercise, brothers and sisters. All right, go to page 14 in your hymn book. No, here's what I want to do, just to show you again. I think what's so exciting about this is that, the social scientists who are doing this incredible research, I think that at some level, social scientists don't get enough credit. All right, we have, the biological sciences, the so-called hard sciences, we tend to think of when we think about STEM, when we think about breakthroughs, we always look at the physicists and the chemists and the biologists and so forth. And I love physicists and biologists and chemists. My father was a chemist, all right? I love the hard sciences. But I think the social sciences do something else. They give us some insight into who we are. They give us insight into who the people we love are. They give us some insight into how we can actually do a little bit better in our lives. And so I want to show you a really interesting piece of social science. In fact, what I want to do here is I want to replicate one of the studies here that I write about, and I want to do it here in real time with all of you as participants. So I'm going to give you three very simple instructions. You're to follow these instructions. Don't overthink it. You're to follow these instructions. All right? The odds of someone getting hurt are very small. You're to follow these instructions. Three very simple instructions. Don't overthink it. Here we go. Instruction number 1. Identify your dominant hand. Very good. Now, with your dominant hand, snap your fingers 5 times very quickly. Very good. Now, with the forefinger of your dominant hand, the pointer finger of your dominant hand, on your forehead, draw a capital E. Very good, class. This is something that's been used, a technique that's been used for 30 years by social scientists to measure whether large crowds will comply with strange instruction. No, just bad joke, sorry. This is a test that's been used since the 1930s to measure attunement, to measure perspective taking. And here's how it works. All right? The 3 instructions. You control for handedness because left-handers and right-handers' brains work differently. So you make sure people are using their dominant hand. Then this thing here, snap, 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 it's just a head fake. It's a misdirection. All right? Because everybody's trying to tease out, okay, what are you trying to find out? And then you ask people to draw the E on their forehead. They actually give people erasable markers to draw the E literally on their forehead. I spared you that indignity. And there are 2 different ways to draw the E. I could draw the E like this, if you can see my forehead here. All right? I drew it so you could see it. Or I could draw it like this. I drew it so I could see it. So this is a test designed to measure attunement, perspective taking. And the idea is this. You put people into an experimental setting. They don't know what you're measuring. You've completely faked them out with the snap, snap, snap. Draw an E on your forehead. Boom. Well, here's what it measures. What's your go-to move? What's your default? What's your instinct? Do you take your own perspective? Or do you take someone else's perspective? What's your go-to move? What's your instincts? Now, for those of you who, so about more than half the people draw the E in the perspective-taking way. And I know some of you drew the E in the non-perspective-taking way. Just to be clear, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. You still might be a bad person. This is just not sufficient evidence. But what's interesting about this is that this quality is very subject to context. So here's some really important lessons. Feeling powerful makes you far less likely to take another's perspective. That when you make people feel powerful, they become less likely to take the other's perspective, more likely to take their own perspective. Very sturdy finding in the social science. This is why many bosses go awry. They feel powerful, they stop taking other people's perspective, and then nobody goes along with them. So there's some really interesting research on how you can, if you're a boss, if you're leading people, sort of lower your feelings of power in a particular moment and become more acute at taking people's perspective and more likely to influence them. There's some great research on the difference between perspective taking and empathy. This right here is not purely empathy. It's really about it's a fraternal twin of empathy. It's not only about emotional intelligence, but it's about really saying, hey, what's on their mind? What are their interests? What are they really seeing? So it has a very hard-headed quality. And it turns out that when you get people a little bit better at mimicry, which is something that human beings do naturally, we mimic each other's gestures and behaviors. When people become a little bit more conscious of mimicry, when they reflect back certain things that other people are doing, they become much more acute at taking other people's perspective. So I love this book. It is my favorite. It's a great combination of really interesting social science, big ideas, but again, some really practical, tactical tools and takeaways that have helped me be a little bit better. So I'm delighted to talk to you about it here, but I'm even more delighted to take your questions. Thank you. So we have standing microphones over here. If you could come up to the standing mic. All right, let's go to standing mic over there. Yes, sir.
So if you were to be hiring people and looking for people with these skills already, what kind of things would you be looking for?
Good question. Tell me your first name.
TJ.
TJ. TJ asks, if you were to be hiring people with these sorts of skills, what would you be looking for? All right, it's an interesting question. Let me come at it in a kind of a sideways response, all right? So, because it allows me to tell you about another really awesome piece of research here. So, okay, get back to the microphone, TJ, please. I'm not very attuned to TJ.
I didn't sign up for a test.
Yeah, who would you hire? What kind of people would you hire?
I would hire people who understood my customer.
Excellent, well said. Would you hire extroverts or introverts?
Both.
Both, well said. All right, so remind me not to ask you any more questions. There's a tendency to believe that extroverts are better at sales than introverts, all right? That's the answer right there. Extroverts are better than introverts at sales. And one reason that a lot of us sort of bristle at this idea of being in sales is that we think we have to be super extroverted. So here's what the research shows. Extroverts, and it's going to go to your question, extroverts more likely to go into sales. Extroverts more likely to be hired in sales jobs. Extroverts more likely to be promoted in sales jobs. There's a very strong advantage for extroverts, except for this. When scholars have looked at the link between extroversion and sales performance, the correlation between extroversion and sales performance, who sells stuff, is essentially zero. Whoa! Does that mean that introverts are better sellers than extroverts? This would be awesome news for people like, I don't know, writers and people who come to book festivals, right? Whoa! Some new research out showing this. Some great research by a guy named Adam Grant at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Here's what he did. He went to a software sales force. He measured the introversion and extroversion levels of the software sales force. Then they went out and sold software. He measured how much software they sold. We know who the introverts are. We know who the extroverts are. Who sold more software? Let's see. Let me give you a test here, all right? Or let me just get your instincts here. So, who sold more software, the extroverts or the introverts? Let's see a show of hands. How many people think the extroverts sold more software? Okay? How many people think the introverts sold more software? All right, yes, that's what we want the answer to be. But it was the extroverts. The extroverts did a little bit better. But that's not the big news out of this study, and it goes directly to TJ's question. The people who did even better than the extroverts, better than the introverts, there was a third group that did significantly better than either one of those groups, and that were the ambiverts. The ambiverts. The ambiverts did better than the introverts, better than the extroverts. There was a huge ambivert advantage in selling stuff, which raises the question, what the hell is an ambivert, right? Again, there's a narrowness in how we think about our work and how we think about our lives. Ambivert is a term that's been in the literature since the 1920s. It describes people who are somewhat extroverted and somewhat introverted. They're kind of in the middle. And as TJ intuited, here's what the research shows. The ambiverts are much better. Strong introverts, terrible salespeople. They're too quiet and don't assert. But you know what? Those strong extroverts, they're almost as bad. All right? There's research showing they're almost as bad. The kind of super gregarious, glad-handing, backslapping, grinning, hey, buddy, what can I do to put you in a Ford Fiesta today kind of guys. They're terrible. They talk too much and listen too little. They come on too strong, right? The people who do the best are the people in the middle, the people who are a little bit of both, and who have the attunement to go left. It's like ambidextrousness, can go left and go right. Here's the best news. Most of us are ambiverts. If you look at the distribution of introversion, extroversion in the population, it's a bell curve. Some of us are very strongly introverted, some of us are very strongly extroverted, but most of us are in our middle. So most of us have the capacity to do this reasonably well if we act like ourselves. So to answer TJ's question, here's what I would advise. Don't hire strong extroverts. Don't hire strong introverts. Hire ambiverts. Hire people who are keenly interested in whatever it is you're selling. Hire people who are willing to do the work to know the customer or prospect's business or situation inside and out. And also hire people who are dogged. And I think if you have dogged, ambiverted experts, that's the winning combination. Let's go over here. How are we doing on time? 6 minutes? 6 minutes.
Hi. On the subject of leaders having less empathy, particularly over time, I wondered if there's any research that shows also sort of the inverse of those people with a high degree of empathy struggling to be successful leaders.
That's a great question. So the question is, if there's so you're basically saying, is there an inverse, there's an inverse relationship between feelings of power and perspective taking. Does this mean that people who are very acute at perspective taking are going to be hobbled and won't be able to become leaders? It's a very, very good question. My true answer is I don't know. I'd have to think about what the exact research is. My instinct is that people who are good perspective takers are actually fairly versatile. And so at some level, it's easier to teach people who are good at perspective taking to be a little bit more assertive than it is to teach non-empathic, non-perspective taking people to see the other people's perspective. That I think that the capacity, that ends up being a very hard transition for a lot of executives to say, we've just done there's something called a 360 review, where you get rated by people below you, above you, side of you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a lot of leaders who get their 360 reviews and say, everybody hates you, all right? And they don't know, and I've seen very few leaders who get that kind of 360 review who are able to actually make the transition to being more empathetic. I do see people as they age, as they get a little bit more maturity and a little bit more experience, have a kind of a new kind of stance. The other thing that's very interesting about that is that there is research on the correlation between effective leadership and humility. And humility correlates very strongly with effective leadership. And I think that humility and perspective taking at some level are close cousins. Hope that answers the question. Yes, Ryan.
So you've actually gotten a little bit into my question. So you've talked, certainly in your research and in your books, about how we motivate ourselves and how we motivate others.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if from that you've gotten any insight into management and management styles and whether or not the conventional wisdom and the conventional structures are as effective as we think they are.
Yeah, great question. So the question is, are there insights into management, and what about the conventional wisdom of management? I mean, well, okay.
Maybe write a book.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is being recorded for posterity, but maybe my grandchildren will look at this one day and say that the rant that their grandfather is about to launch on turned out to be right. So let me give it a whirl here. I think that management is something we take way too seriously. We think that we don't think of, again, there's a narrowness in how we think about things. We think about management as something that has always been here, something that emanated from nature, something that was given to us by God. But that's not true. It hasn't always been here. Management is just something that some guy invented. Management is a technology. It's a technology. It's a technology from the 1850s. It's an 1850s technologies. All right? We have upgraded our technologies. We have upgraded our technology significantly, right? How many of you have a wireless device on you? For how many of you is it a telegraph? You know, an 1840s tech. We've upgraded our technologies. So management is, so we don't use very many 1850s technologies today, right? I mean, if you were here in the winter, you realize DC snow removal is sometimes an 1850s technology, but that's another story. We've upgraded our technology. So here's what I think, Ryan. Management is a technology. We have to think about what the purpose of management is. Management is a technology designed to get compliance, to get people to do what you want them to do the way you want them to do it. That's what it's for. That's what it's designed for. That's what it's good at. And we still need some compliance in our organizations. If you're a teacher in a classroom, you want some level of compliance. If you're a manager, you want some level of compliance. But here's the thing. We want people to be, we don't want everyone to be compliant. If you're a teacher, imagine being in a classroom full of perfectly compliant kids. It's boring. They're not learning that much. Imagine you're a manager leading a perfectly compliant team. How high should I jump, boss? Where do you want me to jump? And so what we want in our workplaces, what we want in our communities, in our schools, is engagement. We want people to be engaged. And here's the funny thing about human beings. Human beings don't engage by being managed. They don't. None of you engage by being managed. Human beings don't engage by being controlled. Human beings engage by getting there under their own steam. That's how every one of you as individuals engage. That's how the people you love engage. That's what it is to be a human being. And so you can't manage people into engagement any more than you can make toast with an iPhone. You can put a piece of bread on an iPhone and turn on the flashlight, and you have some slightly warmer bread, but it's not toast. It's not designed to make toast. Grandkids, someone will explain that to you. What we need in our workplaces and our schools is self-direction. That's how people engage. So all of you who are teachers, all of you who are bosses out there, the technology we want for people to engage is self-direction, giving people some sovereignty over what they do, how they do it, where they do it, who they do it with. That's how human beings engage, and in many cases, that is, I'll sum up on this, that's how human beings engage. So if you really want engagement in your workplaces or your schools or your nonprofit or in the halls of Congress, here's what you want. You want self-direction. You want autonomy over what you do and how you do it. That's how human beings engage. We need less management, more self-direction. We need less talking, more listening on the part of managers. And if we do these things, I really think that we can build better schools, build better companies, and at some level, even build a better country. So on that, thanks so much for your time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.